Hello, welcome to the Berkeley seminar. Delighted to have everyone here. As you know, at the Berkeley seminar, the idea is our speaker brings, today is Ia, who I'll introduce in a moment, brings something that they are working on, that they care about, sort of like a mathematical quest that they're on, and they're going to sort of show us the landscape, and our job is to be sort of standing behind them on the same side, trying to make sense and understand what is the coolness that they see in the project. Cool. All right, so that's the introduction to the Berkeley seminar. Any questions about that? All right. Well, then I'd love to introduce our speaker, Ia Thompson, who is a summer RA here at Topos. They showed up 6 or 7 weeks ago, and we started working on sort of a vague project, and it was really cool. Ia sort of picked up some sort of interesting questions about virtual double categories and started working a bit with Kevin Carlson on that, and is going to share with us today what that work has all been about. All right, thank you so much, Ia.
Thanks. So this talk is going to be on some kind of recent work and results that I found on, well, pro-representable, or it's the term Kevin coined for exponentiable virtual double categories, and kind of some reasons why we might be interested in it, why we might be interested in virtual double categories more general if you're not familiar with them, and some examples as well. So to get things started, to kind of give an outline of the talk, I'm going to start with a bit of an intro into virtual double categories, some kind of comparison / motivation for them compared to pseudo double categories, and then I'll go into the kind of main kind of work and results, this pro-representability stuff, and then if there's time, there's some other things in the appendix that I'll talk about, but otherwise I'll go to the conclusion and references and things. So with that said, we can get started on the virtual double categories. So I'm going to kind of assume that most of everyone is familiar with double categories from previous talks and things in the seminar, but I'm not going to assume any real familiar with virtual double categories. The kind of general idea behind them compared to if you're familiar with pseudo double categories is that we have loose arrows, but we're not assuming that we can necessarily compose them or that we have units for loose arrows or anything, so we don't necessarily get a kind of loose or horizontal bi-category. We just have our usual kind of tight or vertical category, so we have our objects and vertical arrows, and we have loose arrows in cells, and we can compose these cells via kind of pasting diagrams vertically, but I'm not asking that, like these are like sequences of loose arrows, I'm not asking that those sequences can be reduced to single loose arrows. And if I did ask for that, as well as units and things, that would exactly reduce us to the case of pseudo double categories. Just as like a first motivation for why this is kind of a nice setting to work in is that pseudo double categories, the category of pseudo double categories, it doesn't have all co-limits. We have some restrictions there on the type of, or limits, we have restrictions on the type of constructions we can do there, but the category of virtual double categories is finitely presentable, so in particular we have all limits, all co-limits, and they're actually pretty nice to compute. So that's at least one initial motivation for why it might be nice to work with virtual double categories over just pseudo double categories. Another motivation is with respect to a lot of the kind of constructions that we care about on double categories. For example, if we have a category that has pushouts, then we get a pseudo double category of cospans for that category. If we have a bimodules category that has kind of certain has finite products, coproducts, and these commute suitably with the bimodules structure, then we get a pseudo double category of matrices in that bimodules category. And if we have a double category with certain kind of co-limit conditions, we also can get a pseudo double category of monoids or modules in it. However, because of the fact that we have all these kind of like added constraints we got to put on, especially in this like glass case where we can't just apply this construction to a general pseudo double category and get a pseudo double category out, it's a little bit difficult to characterize what, if any, type of universal property these constructions kind of witness. But on the other hand, on the side of virtual double categories, those types of constraints aren't present anymore. For example, for any category, we have associated virtual double category of cospans, no conditions needed. For any virtual double category, we have a virtual double category of matrices. So in this case, the monodal category example is a certain virtual double category where the tight category is trivial. So there's a single tight object, only the identity as a tight arrow, and then the objects of your monoidal category are interpreted as your loose arrows in your virtual double category. And finally, for any virtual double category, we have a unidal virtual double category of modules in it. So we didn't have to put any restrictions on the virtual double category to talk about this module construction or monodule or monoid construction. And one reason why that's really helpful is that there are a lot of results in language of virtual double categories for what kind of universal properties these constructions now behave as. For example, the cospan construction for an arbitrary category can be thought of as like the free virtual equipment. I haven't introduced what an equipment is, but it is it's a certain type of virtual double category with some extra nice structure, which is good for doing formal category theory. But it's a free virtual equipment on that category. Similarly, the kind of matrix construction is a certain kind of free coproduct completion. The module construction is a kind of co-free normal completion, so we're adding those units. And the composite of these last two constructions, the kind of profunctor or distribution construction, can be thought of as a free collage co-completion. So these certain kind of two universal co-limits collages that we're freely adding to this virtual double category. So while in the pseudo double categories we had to restrict to certain ones to be able to even define these notions, in virtual double categories we don't have to worry about that, and in fact we get a ton of nice characterizations of what those constructions kind of represent in a kind of the philosophy of kind of universality of what things are we adding in these constructions, or how are they universally obtained from the original virtual double category we start with. Another reason for working with virtual double categories is it reduces kind of to construct and show that something is a pseudo double category. There's a lot of data there. There's a lot of coherences to check in your kind of associativity and things. But on the other hand, if you construct a virtual double category where you don't have to worry about those associativity coherences or anything, then the question of whether it's a pseudo double category is often much easier to answer than constructing the pseudo double category straight from the outset, because of the fact that there are these, I'm not going to get too much or really at all into it in this talk, but we can kind of characterize the notion of composition as certain universal cells, and just the existence of these universal cells is enough to guarantee that the virtual double category actually represents a pseudo double category. So we can reduce like all these coherence checks for pseudo double categories to just checking the existence of some universal cells. So that's another reason why it's nice to work with virtual double categories, even if you're only really interested in pseudo double categories. I guess so this is the last slide for the kind of intro to virtual double category stuff. So I'll pause here. Any questions at this point? Yeah.
Does normal co-completion mean something like the word normal there?
Yeah. So that normal means you're freely adding a loose unit. So you're adding units in the loose direction. Good question. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just trying to paraphrase. So I have like, we often want all these constructions for pseudo double categories, but often to then do them, you have to add a bunch of constraints. Like your
Yeah.
pseudo double category has to have X, Y, Z.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
we could do sort of like analogous ones for virtual double categories, just for every virtual double category. And then if we want to go back to the pseudo double category case, you just have to check some. I sort of maybe lost the last few sections.
Yeah. So the thing with the nice thing about virtual double categories is that knowing that we can always do this and always get a virtual double category is nice, even if you care about pseudo categories only, because of the fact that like constructing something and showing it's a pseudo double category just like by itself, you have all these associativity and unit kind of coherence diagrams you need to check. But if you already have a virtual double category that's like what you want it to be, and it's just the question of can I compose loose arrows, you can do that by just showing the existence of certain, like, pretty much you can think of it as like showing the existence of certain limits or co-limits. Like you're just showing certain universal cells in this virtual double category setting.
What's this COD25 reference I was trying to...
Yeah, so that's, well, I can maybe go to the references real quick. It's the universal characterization of profunctors. Kawase, double categories of profunctors. Yeah. OK. So that's kind of an overview of why we can care about virtual double categories, why they're interesting, and kind of what's nice about them in terms of reducing these coherence checks to more combinatorial universal properties that we can characterize in terms of these cell pastings. And now to pro-representability. So what do I mean by pro-representability? Well, here, so this term is suggested by Kevin. We say that a virtual double category is pro-representable or exponentiable if the functor given by taking its product with another virtual double category admits a right adjoint. So you might be familiar with Cartesian closed categories and things where this always happens. But just like the category of categories, sorry, not the category of categories, just like if you look at like a slice category in the category of categories, or if you look at, if you're familiar with multi-categories, we don't have necessarily Cartesian closedness. And similarly, for virtual double categories, as we'll see with a counterexample a little bit later, we also can't have Cartesian closeness. And one way to check this, as we'll see, is that if a virtual double category is pro-representable, so we have this adjunction, then in particular that means that taking its product preserves all the co-limits that we can do for virtual double categories. So we can see that there are certain virtual double categories that don't preserve, like if you take this co-limit, then you take the product, you get one thing. But if you do the product first, often you'll lose a bunch of cells unless you satisfy this pro-representability condition that we'll see. So that's one way of seeing that, well, one way we'll see soon that we don't have Cartesian closeness, but we do have a large collection of exponentiable objects, just like with multi-categories, which I might talk a little bit more about as we go along. So to kind of explicate things a bit, so if we had such a virtual double category, if we could construct an exponential like this, what would its objects consist of? Well, what are the kind of data that it would make it up? Well, using that adjunction that we can kind of go back and forth between functors into a thing, into the exponential versus functors out of a product, we can characterize this data, and on its face, it looks a little bit strange compared to what we're used to. Namely, we don't get objects as lax functors, we get objects as functors between tight categories. We don't get tight natural transformations, we get natural transformations between these types of functors. Our loose arrows are now maps of spans, where here, this category in the middle is the category where you forget all of the multi-cells. You just look at the kind of unary cells. So you just have just squares, and then you have their edges. So that gives you this, the span is given by looking at the edges of squares or loose arrows. And then the loose arrows are just maps of these spans. And then finally, the multi-cells are certain things filling this type of boundary, which satisfy a bunch of coherence things, which I'll get to on the next slide, namely that it's an assignment given a certain multi-cell. So there's a lot of things going on to try to break it down. If we have a multi-cell in our double category D, the thing that we're exponentiating by, if you remember. We have D right here that we're exponentiating by. If we have a multicell of the appropriate shape in there, we can create a multicell in the codomain virtual double category. And what we want this to do is be compatible with all of the different span type maps that we had as our loose arrows, and as well as the natural transformations that we had as our tight arrows. Namely, we want to have a kind of functoriality with respect to pasting. And so in particular, all of these are now just unary cells because that's all we can consider in terms of our loose arrows. And all of that data constitutes what would be the exponential if it exists. So a question you might have at this point is, well, we're able to specify all this data. Why can't we just have a virtual double category at this point, right off the bat? Yeah, question?
And the way that you know that is from some kind of like Yoneda style calculation?
Yeah, so so the way that doing is that we can pick out objects in the virtual double category using the virtual double category that has a single object and no loose arrows. And so when we do this, we get the product of these two things. But because of the fact that this has no loose arrows, this product is actually just the underlying tight category for D. And because of that, it has to just map into the tight category for E. And then the other things are similar, where instead of the single object with no loose arrows, you put in a single tight arrow with no loose arrows, or a single loose arrow with no identities, or a bunch of squares. And the key thing is you're not putting any identity cells, as we'll see. Those will get us into the monoids in this virtual double category, which will turn out to be the things we want, namely lax double functors, tight transformations, and modules between the multi-modulations, all these things. Yeah?
Here, these VDC hom sets, are you considering them as categories? Hom categories?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. They can be sets, or you can also think of them as categories because you can also consider the tight transformations. So I, so far, have mainly been focusing on just the underlying, like, one categorical universal property, just consider them as sets. But I'm pretty sure, I don't want to commit to it too hard, but I'm pretty sure the universal property would carry through and give us like an actual two adjunction when you consider the pro-representable virtual double categories. Good question. Yeah.
I'm kind of limping along with the definition of category internal to cat, which may not be enough.
Mm-hmm.
Are loose arrows the arrows in the like arrow category in that definition?
Yeah, good question. Let me, I think, because
like get you too off track.
No, all good. Yeah, since you came a little bit, let me quickly jump back to just the definition here, just so we have it. So. All good, yeah. So for virtual double categories, normally for like double categories familiar from previous talks, we have these loose arrows, which are like, we kind of think of like two possible different ways of objects interacting. The loose direction and the tight direction. Normally in like pseudo double categories, we assume that we can compose these things. It might not be like a very well-behaved composition, like we might have only associativity or units up to some isomorphisms, but we can compose them. But for virtual double categories, we're not assuming we can compose them at all. We just have these kind of relations, these loose arrows, and then we can form these bigger kind of cells with them as boundaries. Okay. Yeah, but I think maybe a good example to consider, which will come up later, so which is why I want to mention, is that if you have some category E, we have a virtual double category of cospans. So its objects are just the objects of E. Its tight arrows are just the normal morphisms in E, and then its loose arrows are given by cospans of morphisms, like that.
So a virtual double category need not have like a loose identity for each.
Exactly, yeah, definitely.
Have that
Yeah, in this case, we will have loose identities, but in general, yeah, we definitely won't have
that one has no, the first argument of the home.
this thing.
Yeah, that dot,
Mhm.
the I guess initial.
Oh yes, yeah, exactly, yeah. This has no loose identities.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. If I were to draw it completely, it's just like an object with with a vertical identity and then no other data. We have no loose arrows at all.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so now that we kind of understand a little bit what the exponential would look like if it existed, as I was kind of saying, you might ask why can't we just get a virtual double category at this point? Like if we can describe the cells, why can't we just compose them? And we'll see this a little bit later in the counterexample to like Cartesian closeness, but just to kind of give a vague idea of it, the issue is that if you were to compose these types of multicells, and then if you wanted them to act on a multicell, like for example, let's take a simple case where I had, say, A, B, C, D, X. Actually, wait. Sorry. Let me do this like this. C, Z, W, and then some U. Okay. So in this context, these nodes are those functors between the tight categories. The vertical arrows are those natural transformations. The loose arrows are those maps of spans that we had. And then the big cells are something that should act on cells in D of a particular shape. In particular, I would need to know, for example, if I have a cell that's of this shape in D, how can I act on it by this cell?
By the like big.
But yeah, by the big composite. If I wanted to have a composite, how would the composite act on this? Because the composite has 3 loose arrows as source and 1 as the bottom, same as this, so it should be able to act on this somehow. But in order to do that, it seems like we somehow need to almost decompose this so that it looks like this composite, like the kind of way that it's pasted, and then paste them individually, or like apply them individually before pasting. So this suggests that we need to somehow be able to decompose cells in D before we can apply a composite of these multicells.
This is a really important point. That might be hard to understand.
Yeah.
I think I'm still confused, honestly, about like what the cells are. So like,
Yeah.
if I just look at like your uppermost like x, y, a, b square,
Mm-hmm.
that is supposed to represent. Then given a cell like you have on the right hand
Yeah.
side in D, I'm supposed to assign a something, but I don't.
Yes. Yeah. So the good question. So what it is that so a cell, we have nodes being these functors, vertical arrows being the tight natural transformations. The loose arrows you can think of as just assignments on the loose arrows, like a map of loose arrows from those in D to those in E, as well as a map on the squares, the unary squares. And then a multicell like this is saying that if I have a multicell of the same shape in D, I should be able to act on it and get a multicell of that shape in E. So it's like an assignment on just multicells of a single shape, namely the shape in this case, or I guess in this case,
So like
multicells of this shape for this big composite.
the big composite, but like the x, y, a, b square only
Yeah.
acts on multicells of that shape.
Exactly, yeah, only the unary multicells. Yeah. of like the exponential itself. Yeah, so maybe, I guess, I'm just thinking if I I guess I'll jump one of the punchlines, which is that we'll see that all representable virtual double categories, i.e. all pseudo double categories, are pro-representable. So they are exponentiable. So we can form this type of thing for pro-representable virtual double categories. Well, D is pro-representable, E doesn't have to be, it could be any type of virtual double category. But let's maybe see an example of that. So one example you could maybe take is, let's do example. Take D to be, let's say, the loose double category associated with the category for the poset 2, which is to say we have 3 objects, 0, 1, and 2. Our only tight arrows are identities. And then we have a loose arrow, which is just going between each one of them, as well as a composite thing. And we also have, so that this is actually a double category and not just a virtual double category, I'm also asking that we have loose units and that those have appropriate cells witnessing them as units and things. And so like this is a composition cell, and so satisfies universality. So in particular, this being a virtual double category associated with, in fact, a strict double category is exponentiable. And then for E, let's take, so if we want to send multi-cells in there, 2 multi-cells. Yeah, I guess, yeah, E can just be arbitrary. So now, what is the data in this exponential, which I'm claiming does in fact exist? In this case, our objects are really, we have, like, what is the type category for this? It's just 3 disjoint objects with no non-identity errors between them. So objects are really just triples of objects in E with no other data. The tight arrows, these are just triples of tight arrows. So I get F prime, F prime prime, down to like X prime, X prime prime. And maybe don't want to erase that quite yet. So maybe I'll go over here, the loose things. So loose things were these maps of spans. So in particular, we're only sending the unary cells. We're only acting on the unary cells. So in this case, we have the 3 non-identity loose arrows, and we also have 3 identity loose arrows that are not visible. And the only unary cells we have are identity unary cells. So really, we're only picking out identity unary cells in here. So really, we can just worry about what's happening on the loose arrows. So in particular, loose is going to be giving us so we're going to be picking out some objects and some loose arrows. So for 0, so we have, let me try to draw the diagram that this would be associated to. So if 0 goes to an object E, we get an identity loose arrow there. Then we get, or actually, maybe I won't draw the images of identities, but we can think of getting a similar diagram, E prime, E prime prime, as well as E to E double prime. But we don't necessarily get a cell here, because the loose arrows are only acting on the unary things, and this was a binary cell. So all we're picking out is 3 kind of loose arrows here. Well, technically 6, because the identities also pick out some loose arrows, which will satisfy some conditions. Namely, they'll be picking out monoids in E. Okay. And then finally, yeah.
Sorry, that's a loose arrow between E and itself? Sorry.
I'm not sure.
Which part, sorry?
Sorry, so like a loose arrow goes between 2 objects.
Yeah, so a loose arrow, so I'm saying a loose arrow in here is going to be a map of spans like this. So it assigns, so in particular, it's maps on the type categories that assigns the unary cells and the loose arrows to unary cells and loose arrows in E, and with the added requirement that like unary identities and things go to unary identities and stuff. But since those are the only types of unary cells here, it's completely determined by where the loose arrows go. So I'm just saying.
Actually, are you sure that these looses actually preserve
Sorry?
identity squares? Are you sure these looses actually preserve identity squares? It doesn't say so on the.
Yeah, because this is a category whose objects are loose arrows.
Spans of
Yeah,
categories.
yeah. So all of these are categories. All of these are functors of categories. Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
But you haven't drawn here, and I think this is what Sophie was worried about. You haven't drawn 2 different F0 and F1s, really, have you?
Right. That's a good point. So, yeah. So really, we can think of it as we get objects E prime, E prime prime. We get x prime, x prime prime, and then a loose arrow between these is now we get E goes over to x prime, E prime goes over to x prime prime, and E also goes over to x prime prime. And then we also have ones from E to x, E prime to x prime, and E prime prime to x prime prime, associated with the loose identities that I didn't draw. Yeah, good catch. Do you want to still see the multicells, or good?
I would.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, maybe I'll redraw this later for if we get to that. So let's consider the kind of one multicell that's kind of going to be interesting, which is ones that are 2 to 1. So here, so multicell. So we're going to have, let's say, let's do x prime, x prime prime. We have a thing over to y prime prime, thing over to z prime prime. Then we have this type of situation down to a prime prime, over to b prime prime, and then like that. Okay, so that's the boundary of our multicell. And then what's our multicell actually going to do? Well, it's going to take each cell of this shape, which there's only one. Well, there are more than one because there's also ones for the loose identities. But ignoring that for a quick second, there's only one that doesn't involve loose identities, this one. And so what that is going to be mapped to is something along the lines of we get x. We're going to go over to y prime, go over to z prime prime. We take this map down to a. We go over to b prime prime to z, and then we get a cell in here associated with this cell.
Cool. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for writing it all out.
No worries. Okay, any other questions before we move on?
Well, we didn't get to see why you can compose these in this case, but that's not. To
Oh,
say
yeah,
you
that's
should
fair.
necessarily do that right now. That's just I feel like the big interesting thing. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I might get back to that. Well, I think that will be kind of explicated when we get to why representable virtual double categories are pro-representable. So with that said, keep going. So this is the main theorem. First, just kind of in words, and then I'll show it more in diagrams, which will hopefully be a little bit better. But a virtual double category where this notation with the underline is saying that we are looking at the collections of cells, of multi-cells where we have a certain specified collection of loose arrows on top and a certain class of specified loose arrows on the bottom, but we're not specifying anything about the tight arrows on the side, just all of those loose arrows. And then given that, we can talk about the kind of vertical pasting that occurs in multi-categories as a map from a coend of this certain product and pullback of things. So it's kind of a complicated expression, but the diagram will hopefully help clear what is going on here into the composite. And then in order for it to be pro-representable, we need all of these to be isomorphisms, which is to say all multi-cells can be decomposed. Like if we have a multi-cell with a certain length, if we take a partition of that integer length, and yeah, if we take a partition of that integer length, then we can uniquely decompose it up to associativity of composition. So we can decompose any given multi-cell as a composite of things. Yeah, question?
Maybe asking the intuition behind pro with that.
Yeah, great question. So one reason I think for the naming of pro-representable is that in multi-categories, so multi-categories you can think of, if you're not familiar, as virtual double categories where the tight category is trivial, so you just have a single object and a single tight arrow. In that language where when like the exponentiable objects there were also characterized, and it turns out that they're exactly the promonoidal categories. So they are categories that have a kind of monoidal structure, but in the bicategory or double category of pro-functors. So that's one of the, I think, motivations for pro. Yeah, good question. Okay, so the kind of more diagrammatic way of saying this is that if I have some integer, and if I take a partition of that integer, and if I have a multi-cell, so these underbars mean that we have like a sequence of loose arrows there. It's not just a single loose arrow. If we have a multi-cell with that given appropriate shape, then I can decompose it as a composite of multi-cells where the bottom one is now the number of integers in the partition, and then each of those is a multi-cell from the length of the different different integers in the partition. And the kind of uniqueness thing is that in this I can insert cells kind of in between the top and the bottom, and I can either, we'll see this a bit later, but you can either first compose the cells vertically with the bottom cell to get a new kind of globular thing here, or I can do that first by composing them up vertically, and we say that those two decompositions are equivalent. So it's unique up to that type of associativity equivalence.
And that middle row that you're mentioning in the coend, that's just sticking in some unary.
Exactly, yeah. That's what we're always just sticking in unary cells here, just a big sequence of unary cells. Yeah. Yeah.
Aren't cells like associative on the nodes?
Sorry?
You said up to like associativity of the cells. And
Yes. Yeah. So
what does that mean?
the composite is going to be the same between any two decompositions, of course, but like I'm kind of saying that I'm treating the decomposition itself as an object and saying that two such decompositions are equivalent if they can be written up to inserting some, well, not inserting, but like taking one of these either on the top and bottom and pulling out some unary cells along the center. And so like they are always going to be, like the composite's always going to be the same multi-cell, but the decomposition like what these cells are or what this cells are might be different. Yeah, good question. Okay, so to give kind of a first example of this, which I hinted at earlier, is that representable virtual double categories, i.e. pseudo double categories, are all pro-representable, so we can exponentiate them. And the kind of idea behind this is that we can, for any multi-cell and any partition of it, we always have a kind of canonical decomposition given by taking the composites, taking the unbiased composites of the various chains of multi-cells. So we always have existence of these decompositions. That gives us surjectivity, but also, and this will hopefully give a little bit more clarity on the kind of inserting things in the middle. If I had any other decomposition, then I can also factor it through these composites, and then what I get in the middle is exactly a bunch of unary cells. And so and if I paste this down, I get back to the big cell down here that we had previously by a kind of uniqueness argument. And so the kind of canonical decomposition is equivalent to any other one up to putting in or up to shifting a bunch of unary cells from the top to the bottom, or vice versa. So that's kind of a quick overview of it, but any questions about why representable virtual double categories are pro-representable, or about the condition itself about inserting these unary cells? Okay, sweet. So that's the first example, but then you might be wondering, are there any examples that are pro-representable but aren't representable? And we actually have a nice kind of family of examples I hinted at earlier, which is that for any category, the associated virtual double category of cospans is pro-representable, and it's only representable if it has all finite pushouts. So even without assuming any colimit assumptions, we always get pro-representability, which is really nice. So to give a kind of intuition for why this is true, first, what do multi-cells in here even look like? Well, they look on the top, it's going to be a sequence of cospans, just like the usual thing, you have a bunch of loose arrows. And the requirement is that for each vertex in each cospan, we have a map down to the vertex in the bottom cospan, and then all the little triangles and squares and the kind of trapezoids that we get, all of those commute. So that's, we didn't need to take any pushouts to be able to define that. We just have that immediately, those maps from the vertices of the cospans. And then if we wanted to decompose this, what we can do is we can kind of slide up along by inserting a bunch of identities on the vertex. And so we get all of these cells just slid up a level, and then all these little internal things are going to commute because we asked previously that all of our little triangles commute. And these maps from A into the vertex are just the unique ones that we get by following either direction. And so we can always do this kind of sliding. And to give an idea of the uniqueness argument, it's a little bit more involved. But to give an idea, in the case where we have n equal to 3, so we have 3 things on the top, and then we're partitioning it as 2 plus 1. Well, in that case, what we get is we have some arbitrary decomposition over here. So we have a 2-cell, a 1-cell, and a 2-cell. And at this point, we can do the same type of sliding trick that we did for the kind of canonical decomposition, and slide these maps down here in this 2-cell, in this 2-cell, up into 2 unary cells, and then we have a 2-cell down here. And then when we compose it up here, we exactly reduce down to the canonical decomposition. So again, we have a relation between like this kind of canonical decomposition and an arbitrary decomposition by inserting some unary cells, or shifting unary cells from the top to the bottom, or vice versa. Any questions about the cospans or what's going on in there.
It seems like that says every decomposition here like has a map to the canonical one directly, like the canonical decomposition is a terminal decomposition or something like that.
Yeah, I haven't thought much about like if I can think of some more structure on the decompositions, but that does definitely, like in this case and in the case for representable virtual double categories, it definitely seems like we have a canonical decomposition that we can make, and then any other decomposition has a unique way of getting there.
Points at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Seems probably special.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it might be interesting to see if there's a way to classify what virtual double categories can do that. But yeah, any other questions about this? Okay, great. So have about 3 minutes left, and it actually works out relatively well time-wise, except for I won't get to the appendices, but I just wanted to quickly go over a non-example. And we have a non-example kind of right away at almost the simplest case. If I take the virtual double category with two objects, a single loose arrow between them, and no unidal loose arrows, so in particular this is not representable, as soon as we do that, we don't get a pro-representable thing. And I have kind of it written on the board, but I think it'll be good to go through in a little bit.
So the point is that this one is missing the identity for rows?
Yes, yeah, it doesn't have any identity pro arrows. Yeah, so it's kind of like a non-unidal version of the loose arrow. And so the idea effectively is that if we have this diagram in virtual double categories. When we take its co-limit, we get a virtual double category that can be kind of summarized by this shape. So in particular, it has a unary cell here, a nullary cell here, a 2-to-1 cell here, and then this big composite unary cell.
What is TRG?
Triangle. Yeah. So so yeah, maybe let me explicate some of these things. So the diagram here, the top thing is the double category with no loose arrows and a single non-identity tight arrow. So maybe let me do this, 0, 1. The triangle over here is the thing with 3 distinct objects, 2 non-identity tight arrows, and a single loose arrow and a single cell filling it. No identity loose arrows. And so this is mapping to this edge right here. Then over here we have a square. No, again, all of these things we don't have any identity loose arrows. We have a cell in here. This is mapping to this edge right here. Then down here we have the same thing as in the statement, which is a thing with a single loose arrow and no identity loose arrows. And it's mapping up to this target. We have another one, which is mapping up to the bottom there. And then we have a square 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and a cell here. And these are picking out those 2 arrows respectively. And then what you get is this composite diagram. And in particular, the thing that's kind of interesting is like the whole is more complicated than the sum of its parts, is that when we take this co-limit, the composite diagram suddenly has to have this composite cell. Like none of the individual things had anything to do with it. They just had, like, one of them had this individual 2-to-1 cell, one of them had this individual nullary cell, one of them had this individual unary cell. But when we paste them all together in this co-limit, we get a unique kind of filling of this type of diagram. And that is kind of hinting at one of the issues with why this is not going to be pro-representable, is that if I were to take the product with loose right now of this co-limit, I would have this unary cell, which I could get. So like, let me try to do that. So if this co-limit is C, if I take the product with loose, then we're going to have something like x naught 0 to x1 1. We're going to have y1 0 to y2 1. So we're going to have a cell like this, which is like a product of a unary identity in the loose thing and that unary cell. And we're also going to have the big composite cell taking a product with it, which is to say we have x naught 0 to x1 1. And then we're going all the way down to z naught. So we go to z naught 0 z1 1. And we can fill this. And you can kind of see at this point why, if we did the product before we took the colimit, we wouldn't be able to get we wouldn't be able to get this cell, because if we got it, it would have to arise as something that's given by kind of a decomposition like this. But this y1, we're already at 0, so we'd have to kind of go to -1 to be able to actually get a decomposition of this cell, which isn't possible for the walking loose arrow. I think I'm already over time a little bit, so I'll stop there and go to the references if anyone's interested in those. Yeah.
I'm curious where this, how you arrived at this set of questions.
Yeah. Really good question. So I was talking with Kevin, and I was kind of thinking about something involving like loose bimodules and virtual double categories or something, trying to understand them in a context where we have a little bit more kind of colimit or limit structure. Mainly, one of the inspirations was how virtual double categories has all colimits and limits and things, so we can do a lot of constructions and stuff. And so like my original thing for going to Kevin was, I'm kind of interested in what it'd be for loose bimodules. And then Kevin kind of proposed the idea of thinking about, well, we know that multi-categories aren't Cartesian closed. We don't have exponentials there. And you can kind of think about, is the same thing happen in virtual double categories? And Kevin already had some evidence that it isn't Cartesian closed. So the question was like, what are the exponentials there? But then there was also kind of the underlying question of, we have this kind of structure of virtual double categories. We can do a lot of formal category theory inside of it in formal mathematics. And then there's a question of, well, is this enriched over something? Like how in enriched category theory, like the category of categories is enriched over itself. We know that can't be because, at least for the product, we don't have Cartesian closedness. But just kind of asking, well, what do we have in terms of enrichment of the Hom sets for our category of virtual double categories? Like, does the VDC of thing to thing have some more structure than we give it credit for as just like a set or as a category? Yeah. Yeah.
You had the skip your future work slides.
Oh, right.
I was
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah. So the kind of some future directions I'm thinking about right now is one is characterizing the exponentiable maps between virtual double categories. So one of the things that I didn't really talk about much is that there's a story for like the category of categories. It's Cartesian closed, so it has all exponentials, but not all of its maps are exponentiable. And there's a nice kind of characterization of what maps are, and that characterization actually has a lot of analogies, or is very similar, could be done very similarly to the characterization of what virtual double categories are exponentiable. So there's one question of, can we generalize that argument a little bit that appears in the case of exponential maps between categories, and characterize what are the exponential maps between virtual double categories. So that's one thing. Another thing is to kind of, now that we have these pro-representable virtual double categories that we know are more, like there are more of them than just the pseudo double categories, but not all virtual double categories are them. is to try starting to think what constructions are they closed under, and in particular, like what limits and co-limits are they closed under? Like, can we take filtered co-limits of pro-representable things and get a pro-representable thing, stuff like that. And then finally, kind of separate, but the thing I've been thinking about is with the, like, for Sophie's question, like the philosophy of like, oh, what is this enriched over, is thinking about loose bimodules and see if that gives like an alternate way of doing a kind of, some kind of enrichment in virtual double categories or in something else. Yeah?
More on the pro thing. Do you think that these pro-representable virtual double categories are some kind of pseudo category in pro functors or something like that?
That's a really good question. I haven't yet had a chance to explore like the analogies with the pro-monoidal kind of story, but I'm definitely very curious to see if like the kind of different characterizations that we have there can like appear here as well. And it's just kind of at this point trying to figure out what's the best way of phrasing that analogy, like what to replace the different data with. But yeah, I'm definitely I don't have an answer for it, but I'm definitely curious about that. Yeah.
So a while back, Kevin and I were looking at this problem of trying to define the analogous of like the analog of like the lax functor VDC for double categories in a setting where everything is virtual to begin with, and we ran into this. It goes pretty well up until the very end when you're trying to figure out how to compose multi-modulations in this setting where everything is virtual. And it seemed at the time that we needed some kind of factorization condition. It wasn't clear to me at all at the time what that was supposed to be. I'm wondering whether either of you have got back to that problem.
Well, this is the answer to the problem. What the factorization property you need is pro-representability.
Yeah, but that doesn't actually like I mean, that's the beginning of an answer to the problem. I mean, like, can you know whether is pro-representability automatically satisfied in that construction? Like, are there extra conditions that you would like we have an explicit like
the pro-representability of to build the virtual double category of models of a theory D.
Yeah.
The factorization property you need is pro-representability for D. So
Okay.
there's something about the typing of our sentences wasn't lining up.
Yeah. We can talk more about this offline, I guess. But okay. Like the objects in this thing are like the objects in this are the functors between the type categories. But the objects in the VDC.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. You
Where-
didn't get to
where-
make this point about mod of
Oh yeah.
D.
Yeah, so just to not go too over, I'll just quickly mention that when we have this exponential, if we look at its modules, then we get all the things that you would normally expect, namely the objects are virtual double functors, the tight arrows are tight transformations, the loose arrows are maps from the unital loose arrow, like the product with the unital loose arrows. So we do have like a unit at 0 and a unit at 1. And the multicells are
Okay, thanks. That's the ingredient.
yeah. And the one thing that with this that I'm still trying to figure out is that it seems like to be able to express the condition for like a multi-cell being a multi-modulation, you need to have this kind of factorization ability, namely to be able to, because in the kind of equivariance condition, equivariance has these compositions of these multi-cells. And so to be able to compose these multi-cells in the kind of equivariance conditions, we need that pro-representability thing of decomposing cells so that we can act on them by these kind of composites.
So you mean you're decomposing naked multimodulations just to be able to even state the definition of a
We're not decomposing the multimodulation. We're composing multimodulations to state the definition of like the kind of like initial thing of just the multicells in the exponential to be able to state the condition for a multimodulation. And in order for those composites to be even well defined, they need to be acting on something that we can do these decompositions with. So I guess one thing is that we don't have really arbitrary decompositions here, so there might be, in order for this, like for the module thing to make sense of multi-modulations, it might be possible, at least to define what a multi-modulation is, not necessarily to compose multi-modulations, but at least to define what they are, it might be possible to relax the decomposition constraint, but I'm still thinking about that, yeah.